All right, well, welcome everyone. Can you take your seats if you haven't done so already? Thank you. So greetings and welcome to the Harvard Catholic Forum's ongoing series on religion and science. I am Deacon Tim O'Donnell, director of the Forum, and I'm happy to welcome you, both you who are with us in person here at the St. Paul's campus in Harvard Square, and those who are joining us on Zoom. The Harvard Catholic Forum engages the Catholic intellectual and cultural tradition through lectures, non-credit courses, master classes, reading groups, and a week-long summer seminar. Today, we will have a chance to explore the foundational Christian theme of forgiveness, examining the evidence of social science, psychology, and lived experience together with the insights of faith. We are honored to have two of our neighbors as co-sponsors this afternoon, the Human Flourishing program at Harvard and the Abigail Adams Institute. And farther afield, thanks go to the Lumen Christi Institute at the University of Chicago, Collis Cornell, and the St. Anselm Institute at the University of Virginia, our partners in the Illumine network of university-facing centers of Catholic thought, for co-sponsoring this lecture and conversation. And finally, this event is made possible through the support of the John Templeton Foundation through its grant Illumine, promoting the Catholic intellectual tradition at campuses nationwide. This afternoon's lecture and Q&A will be archived on the Harvard Catholic Forum YouTube channel. So please share that link with friends and colleagues who would be interested but may not be able to join us now. Our recordings almost always attract more viewers than the original event. You can learn more about the Harvard Catholic Forum on the Forum's website at harvardcatholicforum.org, where you can register for future events, sign up for our emailings, watch archived programs, and support our important mission by making a financial contribution. All of our programs are free of charge, but they are not free to put on, so we are grateful for your help. So let me give you a roadmap of today's event. The lecture segment will last 35 minutes or so, and then we will have an opportunity for some Q&A. Those of you who are here in person should have received a note card and pencil when you came in. If you have a question, please write it on the card. And shortly after 5 o'clock, and then again 10 minutes later, one of my colleagues from the Forum will come up the aisles to collect the cards and bring them to me. I will pass on as many of the questions as I can. For those in our Zoom audience, I will try to take questions through the chat. If you send me an individual chat, I'm on the Zoom webinar as Tim O'Donnell. And here's something important. Please help us to evaluate and improve our programs by filling out our 2-minute survey after the program today. You who are here should have a paper survey. It's the blue paper, and you can fill out with the pencil you have and drop it off by the door as you leave. Zoom participants will get an online version, which again only takes a couple of minutes to click through. So thank you for your help on this. Finally, join us for a reception right after the program. Food and drink are spread out on the table over there. We promise that no one will go home hungry. Speaking this afternoon on the power of forgiveness is Tyler J. VanderWeele, the John L. Loeb and Francis Lehman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology at Harvard, Director of Harvard's Human Flourishing program, and co-director of the Initiative on Health, Religion, and Spirituality. He has written and taught widely on psychosocial measurement theory, psychiatric and social epidemiology, the science of happiness and flourishing, and the study of religion and health. In addition to publishing over 400 papers in peer-reviewed journals, he has authored several books, including most recently, Measuring Well-Being of 2001. Professor VanderWeele has a BA in Philosophy and Theology, as well as an MA in Mathematics from Oxford, an MA in Applied Economics from Wharton, and a PhD in Biostatistics from Harvard. Please join me in welcoming Professor VanderWeele.
Well, thank you very much, Deacon Tim, and thank you all for coming. I will be speaking today on the power of forgiveness. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, we read of Jesus' disciple, Peter, coming to him and asking if someone repeatedly wrongs him, how often should he forgive? Peter inquires if it's necessary to do so up to 7 times. Jesus' response is not 7, but 70 times 7. If we do the math, that is rather a lot. But is this realistic? Is this practical? Will this not result in excessive hurt and repeated offenses and injustice? Can such an approach really bring healing and reconciliation? Does forgiveness really work? Does it really help? In what follows, I will briefly consider the concept of forgiveness, review some of the empirical evidence concerning forgiveness and health. I will discuss forgiveness interventions and also recently developed workbooks to promote forgiveness, touch upon issues concerning the morality of forgiveness, and then we'll ponder some of the potential implications for policy and for politics, for our own lives and relationships, including forgiveness of oneself. And I will conclude with a return to the question that St. Peter posed to Jesus. In the past years, the topic of forgiveness has received considerable attention from, believe it or not, the empirical social sciences. We tend to think of forgiveness as something intangible, relational, perhaps theological, almost defying measurement. But measurement of forgiveness and efforts at its empirical study have in fact been made extensively over the past decades. This is, of course, not necessarily easy to do, and to do so we need to understand what is forgiveness if we are attempting to assess it. Forgiveness is sometimes understood as a victim's replacing ill will towards an offender with goodwill. Or alternatively, reducing negative thoughts, emotions, and behaviors towards the offender with positive thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Distinctions are sometimes made between what's sometimes called decisional forgiveness versus emotional forgiveness. Decisional forgiveness in the psychology literature is really the intention to forego revenge, to treat the offender as a person of value, that commitment to replace ill will towards the offender with goodwill. Emotional forgiveness is sort of the replacement of negative, unforgiving emotions with positive, other-centered emotions. And typically the former, decisional forgiveness, will precede the latter, emotional forgiveness. So for example, forgiveness of someone who's insulted one may involve replacing a desire for that person to be fired from their job with a desire that that person change or reform. That would be decisional forgiveness. But even with that decisional forgiveness, those feelings of anger might still persist and return. That letting go of that anger is emotional forgiveness, and that can take time. I think that distinction between decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness is also quite helpful in making sense of one's own experience, where one believes one has forgiven and has made the commitment, but then finds oneself 2 days later still experiencing anger. What has happened? Have I really forgiven? Well, decisional forgiveness may in fact have taken place, but emotional forgiveness still may need time. I think that distinction between decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness can also help us to make sense of some of the scriptural texts concerning forgiveness, including the command to forgive. It can be confusing to think about how could we be commanded to forgive if forgiveness is principally about one's emotions. One has some control, but not complete control over those. But if the command to forgive is really understood as a command towards decisional forgiveness, a commitment to replace ill will towards the offender with goodwill, then we can make sense of that commandment. That sort of decisional forgiveness is something that can always take place. The emotions may still take time to heal, but we can always commit to having goodwill towards the offender. Forgiveness, understood as replacing ill will towards the offender with goodwill, thus can be distinguished from excusing the action or forgetting the action, of forbearing, distinguished from reconciling. It can be distinguished also from not demanding justice. Forgiveness does not necessarily entail foregoing justice. One can forgive and have goodwill towards the offender while still also pursuing a just outcome. As an example, after the 2015 shooting massacre at an African Methodist Episcopal Church in South Carolina, the relatives of those who were slain by the shooter, Dylan Roof, told him that they forgave him and were praying for him, while also conveying to him the extraordinary suffering that he had caused. Such forgiveness did not mean foregoing legal proceedings, nor did it ignore what had taken place, but it was a movement of goodwill of the members of that church, and an expression of hope that Dylan Roof would repent, would change, would realize the wrong that he had done. The existing empirical research on forgiveness suggests that forgiveness itself, even as assessed by simple self-report questions, survey questions, that forgiveness is in fact associated with better health. The mechanisms are thought to be forgiveness being sort of a beneficial alternative to other possible responses to wrong, such as suppression, trying to pretend the event didn't happen, or rumination, coming back to it again and again. In our own research at the Human Flourishing program at Harvard, we've followed a cohort of about 6,000 young adults over many years, looking at their experience of forgiveness and how that plays out with regard to various health and well-being outcomes. We found evidence that forgiveness of others is associated with better psychological well-being, including greater life satisfaction, greater happiness, greater self-esteem, as well as better mental health, fewer depressive symptoms over time, less anxiety over time. And this is even after controlling for a host of other things, including baseline health and mental health. We've found to date relatively little evidence of an effect on physical health, though this point is still disputed somewhat in the literature. Our current sample was a relatively young set of adults, and so it may be that the effects on physical health are more prominent later in life, but this is one of the still open research questions. But the evidence for mental health and for psychological well-being is now quite compelling. Even stronger evidence randomized trials of forgiveness interventions. These are the same sorts of trials we use to evaluate treatments or vaccines, but they've been used to look at how various therapy interventions trying to promote forgiveness might be related to mental health. A recent meta-analysis summarizing the evidence of 54 different intervention studies suggested a fairly sizable effect of these forgiveness interventions on improving forgiveness, but also lowering depression, lowering anxiety, and improving hope. I think the evidence from these trials are now quite clear. Forgiveness improves mental health. In terms of kind of making sense as how we can bring about forgiveness, there are a couple of fairly prominent forgiveness models to help promote forgiveness. One of these is Enright's process model, and another is Worthington's reach model. They're not all that dissimilar if one digs into the details, but some subtle differences. Enright's process model takes place over 20 different steps organized into 4 phases. First, uncovering the negative feelings about the offense. Deciding to pursue forgiveness for a specific instance, working towards understanding the offending person, and discovering of unanticipated positive outcomes and empathy for the forgiven person. Interventions using this process model have been effective with groups as diverse as adult incest survivors, parents in difficult adoption cases, and inpatients struggling with alcohol and drug addiction. In Worthington's REACH model, which is the model we've been working with, each letter of REACH, R-E-A-C-H, stands for a different part of the process. Again, not all that dissimilar from Enright's process model, but R is recall. Recall the hurt and the emotions associated with it. Let that surface. Don't try to suppress those. E is empathize. Empathize with the offender. Take the other's perspective in considering reasons for the action without in any way condoning the action or without invalidating one's feelings, but try to understand the other's experience as well. A is altruistic gift. Realize that forgiveness is an altruistic gift that can be offered or withheld. Realize also that one has done wrong one's self and has been offered that gift of forgiveness. C is a commitment to forgive, possibly publicly in the context of one's community or friends or family, even if the offender's not present, or possibly privately. But making that decision to forgive, that commitment to forgive, to replace ill will towards the offender with goodwill. And H is hold. Hold on to or maintain the forgiveness through times of uncertainty or through the returning of anger and bitterness, realizing that that process of emotional forgiveness is going to take time, and that does not invalidate the commitment that one has made. Most of these forgiveness interventions do require multiple sessions with a trained counselor or therapist implementing the models, but over the years, these principles have been distilled into a do-it-yourself workbook, a self-directed workbook, taking this REACH forgiveness model into a series of exercises that one can complete on one's own in about 2 to 3 hours. And these workbooks, if you're interested, are freely available on Everett Worthington's website. And we can distribute them as well following this event. But we've recently, to try to assess their effects, we've recently completed a very large randomized trial looking specifically at this workbook in 5 relatively high conflict countries. We've looked at the effectiveness of this workbook in Colombia, in South Africa, in Ukraine, in Indonesia, and in Hong Kong. And we randomized individuals to either receive this forgiveness workbook immediately or to wait 2 weeks' time before they got it. And then we looked after 2 weeks at whether the groups that received it immediately versus those who had to wait, how they fared. This study was about 4,500 individuals in these 5 different countries. And we found effects of this simple 2 to 3 hour self-directed workbook, not only on promoting forgiveness, but once again on decreasing depression, on decreasing anxiety, on improving hope, and on improving various aspects of flourishing, including happiness, meaning, one's relationships. So this paper is right now under peer review, but we are very much hoping that it will attract the attention of the public health and medical community as well as an important resource to deal with these issues of not only forgiveness, but of mental health, of depression, and anxiety as well. We will be hosting a conference, in fact, here in Harvard Yard at Memorial Church next week, Friday and Saturday, April 21st and 22nd, where we'll be presenting the results of this randomized trial in greater detail, but also bringing together theologians, philosophers, psychologists, scholars in peace studies, in law, in politics, to discuss this topic of forgiveness and how we might promote forgiveness in society. It's open to the public and free, so all are welcome. More information both in the back and on the Human Flourishing program website. But I do think, given the evidence that we now have, that this workbook really is a powerful resource to promote forgiveness and improve mental health. I've used it myself personally and have found it quite helpful as well. But when thinking about kind of dissemination of this sort of workbook or promotion efforts for forgiveness, especially at kind of communal or national or international scales, I think it's important to address questions of the morality of forgiveness. Is forgiveness always appropriate? What are the conditions under which forgiveness can and should occur? And in considering this question, I think it's once again really important to distinguish between forgiveness and other related notions like reconciling, forgetting, forbearing, excusing, or not demanding justice. Again, I think one can desire the good of the other without excusing or forgetting the wrongful action or while still pursuing a just outcome. It's another example. In 2016, a 20-year-old boy, while drunk, vandalized a mosque in Fort Smith, Arkansas. He subsequently asked for and received forgiveness from the mosque members. His actions were not justified or excused, but the mosque members made clear that they forgave him and did not want to ruin his life. In this case, the mosque members even asked for a lenient sentence. The case, however, arguably rightly, was treated as felony and bigotry by the courts. Again, forgiveness can take place. One can ultimately desire the good of the offender, even in the context of also pursuing justice. So with these distinctions in mind, arguments have put forward, for example, by the philosopher Margaret Holgram, who will be here next week as well, that provided the victim does not deny the wrong that was done and the implications of this, nor his or her feelings about the offense, forgiveness as the replacement of ill will towards the offender with goodwill can take place. Provided these conditions are met, forgiveness is always appropriate and can take place regardless of whether the wrongdoer repents or asks for forgiveness. And I think this can be quite important in situations where the offender is already dead, perhaps, or is not sorry. Forgiveness as replacing ill will with goodwill can still take place. Forgiveness, again, is also different from reconciliation. Forgiveness may still, in these cases, help free the victim from the offender. I think conversely, if one says something that does deeply hurt or offend another person, even if you believe you've done nothing wrong, it can still be helpful to express sorrow, at least, over the other's pain. In some cases, that itself might facilitate healing and might help the other person to forgive. Of course, in many theological understandings of social relationships and of character, forgiveness is also considered a good in and of itself, a form or expression of love or goodwill towards the offender. Provided that the denial of wrongdoing and the feelings associated with it are avoided, forgiveness, again, replacing ill will with goodwill, it still really does retain self-respect. But it also respects the offender as a moral agent who has failed. The perpetrator's perspective, even if confused, is acknowledged without the victim necessarily having responsibility for changing it. So forgiveness, understood thus, can still free the victim from the past, does not make the victim dependent upon the wrongdoer, and promotes love, compassion, acceptance, harmony in human relations. And such also it seems to have been the case in the Fort Smith community, a vandalism incident. Such genuine forgiveness, Holgram argues, also respects morality because it acknowledges a wrong, it separates the sin from the sinner, and it gives the wrongdoer space to change. Because of these things, forgiveness, it is argued, is thus not only compatible with respect to oneself and with morality and with the wrongdoer as a moral agent, but may, in fact, sometimes be required by these things. And again, I think this has important implications in thinking about forgiveness at a population level, which I'll discuss a little bit later. As before, I do think forgiveness also should not be confused with necessarily entailing a restored relationship. In many contexts, it will, but that might not necessarily be what follows. I think that confusion, equating forgiveness with a restored relationship, is potentially particularly problematic in contexts of say, repeated domestic abuse or intimate partner violence. In such cases, one can still forgive and hope for the good of the offender, even if the right thing to do, even if the thing to do that's best for the offender is in fact separation. However, in less problematic settings, I think forgiveness can and often does facilitate reconciliation. It restores the relationship. That replacement of ill will with goodwill can give room for the relationship to heal. Forgiveness and a gesture of goodwill can also sometimes have a transformative effect on the offender. It can sometimes help the offender to change, and this too can likewise assist with reconciliation. Only a few days after being shot in an assassination attempt, Pope John Paul II told the world from his hospital bed in his Sunday address that he was praying for and had forgiven his assailant, Mehmet Ali Agca. Paul II later visited him in his prison cell to express his forgiveness in person. Years later, although still probably struggling with issues of mental health, Ali Agca considered John Paul II a friend and announced conversion to Christianity. Our own instances of forgiveness and change may not be quite as dramatic, but the effects of forgiveness, I think, can be similar. There's no guarantee that forgiveness will have these effects or will lead to reconciliation, but often it can. I think there are also potentially profound implications for forgiveness at a societal level as well. If it is the case that forgiveness is strongly related to mental health and that experience of being wronged is in fact very common, and that even these self-directed workbook interventions are available and effective, I think a reasonable case can be made that forgiveness should itself be considered a public health issue. To not address forgiveness is to leave many people trapped in resentment and negative feelings and rumination on the past, and ultimately in poorer health. If forgiveness, provided it's carried out in an appropriate manner, is always morally permissible and perhaps from some standpoints even morally required, then I think large-scale efforts to promote forgiveness could be reasonable, important, and very powerful. And the evidence strongly suggests that forgiveness promotes mental health and may lead to a fuller wholeness and health in a broader sense of the wholeness of the person and growth of character and spiritual well-being and in restoration, when appropriate, of relationships. Again, we have evidence now from these randomized trials of both individual, couple, and group level therapy, and even these self-directed forgiveness workbooks, that forgiveness can be powerful. And I think we might therefore think about trying to promote forgiveness at communal, local, national, and international scales. From the perspective of my own discipline of public health, the public health impact of an exposure is often assessed as a function of two things: how common is the phenomena in the population, and how large are its effects. Something that's both common and has large effects on the outcomes that we care about is going to shape population health. The experience of being wronged is very common, and the effects of forgiveness on mental health profound. And so once again, I think forgiveness might be considered not only of moral, theological, and relational significance, but of public health importance as well. But what of St. Peter's question? This approach to forgiveness may seem fine and good for a single offense, but what of 7? Or 70 times 7? Is this realistic? As I've reflected upon this question and upon my own relationships, and principally upon my own marriage, I've increasingly come to appreciate the importance of fostering a forgiving disposition, of making forgiveness a habit, of embedding it within one's character. While I do tend to think my wife and I have a reasonably good marriage, we do also not infrequently upset one another. One of us will make a comment that the other finds hurtful. One of us will not notice some occasion when the other needs help. One of us may not feel adequately listened to or understood. One of us may forget to do what we are supposed to. One of us may pretend not to notice something going on with the children in hopes that the other takes care of it. Each of these individual incidents may seem relatively trivial, but over time they add up and can cause tension, sometimes a lot of tension. We regularly do discuss how we can each improve and do better, but that alone is not enough. One needs to address the past hurts and wrongs and mistakes. One needs forgiveness. We need the forgiveness of one another. Without that forgiveness, that replacing of ill will with goodwill, the ill will accumulates. It can destroy relationships, even otherwise very good relationships. Forgiveness is needed for the restoration of goodwill. As I've reflected upon St. Peter's question and Jesus' response, I've wondered if in my own marriage that 70 times 7 is needed for me, not just over a lifetime, but probably, in fact, each and every year. We need the forgiveness to preserve and restore the relationship, to preserve and restore goodwill, to help us each seek the good of the other. And I think a similar pattern plays out in many, perhaps most, close relationships, whether we are fully aware of it or not. We need forgiveness in our family relationships. We need forgiveness in our friendships. We need forgiveness in our schools. We need forgiveness in the workplace. We need forgiveness in our churches. We need forgiveness not just for our enemies or for those who have badly harmed us, but in all of our relationships. Forgiveness, regular forgiveness, a disposition towards forgiveness, I think is a needed balm for our relationships, but I think it's a needed balm for our society as well. At a time such as ours, in which political and racial divisions can seem increasingly sharp and polarizing, in which hateful messages can go viral through the use of social media, and which consensus can seem ever more elusive, we must find ways of seeking the good together, of seeking the good of one another. There will inevitably be those around us with whom we strongly disagree and disagree on important matters. There will be those around us who offend us and are opposed to us. The approach of forgiveness is not one in which we say disagreements don't matter. Rather, it's one in which we proceed with having goodwill rather than ill will, even while not ignoring those wrongs and injustices. It is to want what is good, even with those for whom we disagree. I think that is the wisdom of love for one's enemies. We need this forgiveness of others in our politics, in trying to rebuild communities, and in trying to establish civil discourse. Without ultimately wanting what is good for the other side, there seems little hope of moving forward, or of in fact attaining what is good, or at least some approximation of it for society. I think forgiveness is a needed practice for our time. It involves a reorientation of the will towards seeking what is good and what is good for all those around us. Moreover, there's also strong empirical experimental evidence that acts of goodwill are themselves contagious. Acting generously towards those around you may prompt generous actions in others as well. It does not always do so, but often. An act of forgiveness does not always help, but can sometimes have a transformative effect on the perpetrator. Forgiveness can help spread that disposition of goodwill and generosity. We should thus, I think, always seek to forgive others. But almost certainly we ourselves make mistakes and hurt others. We are perhaps slower to acknowledge it, but often we ourselves are in need of forgiveness. We need to ask forgiveness of others, from others. And being forgiven for an offense, when appropriate, can help restore relationship with a person offended. Being forgiven can relieve sadness and guilt over the wrong that was committed. Being forgiven can bring about a greater awareness of the needs of others and of one's own shortcomings, and can lead to growth in character. Being forgiven and experiencing the love of the other can help empower one in love as well. But our own need for forgiveness can sometimes be unsettling, sometimes more unsettling than we would like to admit. When we do honestly reflect upon our lives, we realize we are not always seeking what is truly good. Sometimes we do hurt others. Sometimes we are selfish. Sometimes we do things that are destructive even to ourselves. We often fail to live up to our own standards. And this can be unsettling. The guilt or shame or disappointment can sometimes even result in a self-loathing or an ill will towards oneself. We may be in need of self-forgiveness, replacing ill will towards ourselves with goodwill. However, the Christian teaching on forgiveness doesn't simply include interpersonal forgiveness, but really extends beyond that as well. We are taught that God created each person good, and to constantly seek what is good, to seek the highest good. When we fail to seek what is good and to do good as we inevitably do, we have fallen short of the goodness to which we are to aspire. We may feel sadness, disappointment, shame, anger, frustration over our own failures. We may feel we ourselves want forgiveness, not only from those around us, but with respect to who we are as a person and our failing to do good. In the Christian understanding, what we then seek is in fact forgiveness from God, the source of all goodness. What we desire is a restoration to and a reorientation towards goodness itself. And it is that desire for forgiveness that expresses itself in the line of our Father, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. What we seek is a fundamental reorientation to goodness and to the source of all goodness. Our forgiveness of others can help bring about that reorientation to the good, but our forgiveness from God, a forgiveness arising out of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, brings true healing and provides the more ultimate reorientation that we seek towards God as the source of all goodness. The experience of forgiveness of God in our day-to-day lives and in the sacrament of reconciliation can be powerful. It can be freeing. It can help orient us back to what is good. It can potentially help us also with self-forgiveness when needed. Again, that replacing of potential ill will towards ourselves with goodwill. When we know we are loved by God, we can each love ourselves and others more easily and more appropriately. We will often not achieve the perfection we desire, but God always offers forgiveness, and we need that forgiveness from God. So is 70 times 7 realistic? Well, in close relationships, I think it is beyond realistic. I think it is, in fact, often necessary. A forgiving disposition and a reorientation towards goodness, a disposition towards seeking the good of others is crucial. It is in such forgiveness and in that fundamental reorientation towards the good that we come closer to who we are truly meant to be. Forgiveness promotes health. Forgiveness promotes wholeness. Forgiveness can promote goodness of ourselves and others. Forgiveness can bring true human flourishing. Thank you.
So thank you so much. Those in our online audience, maybe if you try the Q&A function rather than trying to send me a message, I'll try to get some of those questions later on. So here's one question. Can forgiveness have to the forgiven, cause the forgiven person to dwell in a state of not growing?
So I wouldn't say forgiveness itself necessarily prevents the perpetrator from growth, but forgiveness is not sufficient for growth. Forgiveness is also not sufficient for justice either. I would never say forgiveness is going to solve all of our problems. I think it's very important. I think it's important individually. I think it's important in society. But other things need to accompany forgiveness. So I think while forgiveness can sometimes empower the growth of the offender and can sometimes lead to transformation, it won't always do so. It may not do so in the majority of cases. I think for that there needs to be repentance on the part of the perpetrator, a desire to change. So I don't think forgiveness inhibits the growth of the perpetrator, but it doesn't necessarily lead to it as well. Again, forgiveness is one of many approaches, I think, to try to bring about that healing and that growth.
What would change if we labeled forgiveness a public health issue? How should public policy change if we did that?
So my hope, and again, we're just at the beginning of this work now with this workbook, is that we would be promoting forgiveness at a societal level. We've been doing some preliminary work on forgiveness campaigns within communities where one discusses what forgiveness is and what it's not, where one discusses the benefits and power forgiveness, where one provides to members of a community these, for example, self-directed forgiveness workbooks. One increases the awareness of forgiveness as a powerful tool to help oneself, to help free oneself from past wrongs and from past harms from one's perpetrator. And so my goal would be to see these sorts of resources and to see forgiveness itself promoted at local, national, and even international levels. I think the evidence we have now suggests that doing so would both help promote forgiveness in society, but also improve mental health. So I think it is an important public health and public policy issue. In clinical context, I think these workbook resources could be helpful supplements to other forms of care for mental health concerns over depression and anxiety. I'm not in any way proposing these as a replacement for more traditional cognitive behavioral therapy approaches, or in some cases pharmacological treatment, but I think it could be a helpful supplement in the process of caring for someone who's struggling with depression and anxiety. I think a clinician could inquire, are you also dealing with anger over a past hurt or wrong? If so, would you like assistance in forgiving? We have these workbook resources. That's not in any way required for one to use it, but if you want to forgive and are having trouble doing so, which is the experience of many, this resource might be helpful. And moreover, there's evidence that it alleviates depression and anxiety. So I think both kind of from a clinical perspective and from a public health or public policy perspective, we could work towards promoting forgiveness.
Let's go out to an even larger sphere. Is forgiveness possible at an international level, in international politics? Can you elaborate on specific examples of victims of genocides, ethnic cleansing, wars, apartheid? Isn't reparation a necessary step in this process before reaching forgiveness?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are difficult conceptual issues when one moves from interpersonal forgiveness to forgiveness at the group level. All of our work to date, and this may change, but all of our work to date at the Human Flourishing program has been interpersonal forgiveness for a given offense between two individuals. And so what I've suggested in this talk is that we make use of these resources at an individual level, and my discussion of promotion of forgiveness at national and international levels has been the promotion of interpersonal forgiveness. Again, I think we could do this at different scales, including international scales, but that's quite different, I think, than dealing with issues of forgiveness when involving groups of people. I think there are tricky conceptual questions with regard to who has the authority to offer forgiveness on behalf of a group, and I don't think those are in any way straightforward. So I do want to clarify that what I was speaking on today was on kind of interpersonal forgiveness, though promoting that at different scales. As I said before, I think when thinking about both interpersonal offenses, but also harms at group level, while I do think forgiveness is an important part of that process, it's not the only part. I do think justice and reparations are important in trying to bring healing to a society or a community. So while I do think interpersonal forgiveness is always morally appropriate, that doesn't mean that that's sufficient to deal with the wrong or harm that was done. And I think the complexities are even greater when it comes to issues of communal forgiveness.
You've done a multinational study. What are some of the most striking comparative findings from the multinational study? And I think this question goes to cultural differences and how that relates to forgiving.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, there's a lot more to be explored with regard to cultural differences in in forgiveness. What we found in this randomized trial was that this workbook was effective at promoting forgiveness across all 5 settings and to a relatively similar extent in each of the 5 countries. We did find some, I wouldn't say definitive, but some evidence for stronger effects on mental health, on anxiety and depression in some of these countries than others. The effect seems smaller in South Africa and in Hong Kong. I can't really speculate at present as to what the reasons for that might have been. And I wouldn't say those differences, kind of from a statistical perspective, are definitive, but some indication that there might have been differences in effects on mental health, on anxiety and depression. There have been culturally adapted forgiveness workbook interventions. The one that we examined was meant to be applicable to absolutely anyone at all, with religious beliefs or not, in any setting or culture. But there's evidence from other studies that when you're making use of some of the powerful cultural stories within a given country of forgiveness, or on the much deeper, say, theological understandings of forgiveness, that the effects of these sorts of interventions are even larger and even more profound. So, for example, there's a workbook that's specifically shaped around Christian perspectives on forgiveness, drawing upon scriptural teachings on forgiveness. And so I think it's worthwhile making use of those resources. So there's more to explore with regard to how understandings of forgiveness vary by culture and how to make use of those cultural differences. But I think our evidence to date suggests that forgiveness can be promoted in quite diverse cultural contexts, and that it does have powerful effects on mental health in many contexts. We are carrying out a large global flourishing study right now with Gallup involving about 200,000 individuals in 22 countries, representing about half of the world's population. And we have a couple of questions on forgiveness there, so we'll be able to get a better sense as to how that experience of forgiveness perhaps does vary across these different countries. So much more to learn, but I do think there's a lot that's common to human experience concerning forgiveness across countries and cultures.
So coming back to the individual person, the question, is it possible to get better at forgiving? And one would think that the answer would be yes, but I wonder whether this is anything that you've measured.
Yeah, I wouldn't say the evidence on this is definitive. From this randomized trial, we have measures both of what's sometimes called state forgiveness, have you forgiven a particular offense, and also what's sometimes called trait forgiveness. Do you have a forgiving disposition in general? The results of this randomized trial suggested that this forgiveness intervention shapes not just state forgiveness, are you forgiving right now, but perhaps also trait forgiveness, becoming more of a forgiving person. The caveat, and it's a big caveat there, is this is 2 weeks out. So is that really retained 6 months out or a year out? The forgiveness workbook does conclude with trying to generalize the experience one has had of forgiving a particular offense to other offenses that one has experienced. It kind of moves towards and tries to push towards developing that more forgiving disposition. I think, as is the case with all aspects of character, when one acts in a forgiving manner, when one forms the habit of forgiving, that disposition becomes stronger and stronger. So I do firmly believe that it is possible to become a more forgiving person. Whether we can bring that about through the use of workbooks, I think evidence suggests possibly, but perhaps don't know definitively to date.
All right, so I have 2 questions here. I'm going to give them to you as a kind of a 1-2 punch together. One is it possible that forgiveness can prevent, or maybe it's widespread forgiveness, can prevent accountability in society? That is to say, loss of a sense of moral hazard. And I'll give you, together with that, really a question about incarceration and if you have any evidence on what forgiveness has to do with sentence levels and the experience of incarceration, post-incarceration, and so on.
Yeah, so good, but difficult questions, as you said, related. As I tried to make clear in my talk, I don't think forgiveness necessarily entails foregoing justice. I think one can forgive and still pursue a just outcome. And I think that is important with respect to accountability and important with respect to the fabric of our life together as a community, acknowledging that offenses and harms have been done. While this is beginning to perhaps enter more controversial territory, and this kind of touches on the incarceration question as well, I think in terms of incarceration or of punishment, I think there are certain goods that can come out of that, and I think that's what should be aimed at in pursuing justice. Those goods, those are goods of restraint, those are goods of reform, those are goods of expressing to the community that a wrong has taken place. Those are goods of deterrence. But I think in bringing about justice and bringing about punishment, it is that good that is ultimately aimed for. And so I think in some sense, one can forgive, one can have goodwill towards the offender while still pursuing what is a just outcome. One might even view that punishment as in some sense a good for the offender, both in terms of, again, restraint and reform, but also in being a member of the community, of participating in that common good of the community. And so, to my mind, punishment properly carried out, the aim is still for the good, even for the good of the offender. I do think that puts bounds and constraints on extent of punishment. But again, I don't think punishment itself, seeking justice, I don't think that is necessarily incompatible with forgiveness, incompatible with having goodwill towards the offender.
This is another question that brings up the justice theme that you've touched on a number of times. Does forgiveness require an undue burden on victim survivors? Or can it, perhaps is the question rather than does it?
I think forgiveness can be really very difficult, especially for major offenses. It can be an incredible struggle. It can take a long, long period of time to bring about. I mean, especially that emotional forgiveness, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. I don't think these workbooks are the appropriate tool for cases of severe offense, for cases of extreme abuse. I think they can be helpful for more minor offenses. The forgiveness interventions overall, I think, can still be quite powerful, but may require 20 sessions with a counselor working through a lot of the pain, a lot of the hurt, and that experience is a burden. It's not going to be easy, but I think one can also turn the question around and ask what is the alternative? The alternative is often suppression, rumination, seeking revenge, which often don't, in fact, free the victim. So while I think forgiveness in those instances can be incredibly difficult and a tremendous burden for the victim, I think it still can be a very powerful response. Everett Worthington, who developed the REACH model, which we tested in this randomized trial workbook, his mother was murdered, and he struggled with forgiveness. His brother committed suicide over the event, and so it was a very long and difficult journey of forgiveness for him. But I think that difficulty, that struggle, that burden, and working through forgiveness, he feels ultimately did free him and has led to tremendous good. That struggle has borne, I think, incredible fruit with regard to this work that he's done on promoting forgiveness.
What about the one forgiven who's conscious of having been forgiven? And the effect of perhaps letting go of a burden on account of that. Has your research focused on the forgiven person to some extent as well?
Yeah, not to date, and I think that's an important topic for future research, because I do think that the effect of being forgiven can be very powerful as well, can be freeing, can lead to, when appropriate, reconciliation, can lead to transformation. So I do think better understanding the conditions under which that change happens, or in one's own life and experience, how to make use of that experience of being forgiven to lead to one's own growth, I think really is important. Again, most of the empirical research, at least to date, has focused on the victim and the forgiveness of others, but I think that experience of being forgiven can also be very powerful.
You spoke of forgiveness being a mental health issue as well as a social issue. With that in mind, do you think primary care physicians should start asking patients if they are withholding forgiveness or to somehow address this? And the comment that comes with this is, it seems we need a mechanism to increase forgiveness at scale.
Yeah, so I mean, I do think primary care physicians are under a tremendous amount of pressure to cover a whole host of things in very limited amount of time. And if time were infinite, sure, I think asking about anger and harms and hurts would be reasonable. But I think often time does not allow that. I think asking perhaps broader, more general questions on are one's relationships going well in general, and then possibly providing referral as needed to someone else who might help could be a useful way to touch on not just forgiveness, but on many other difficult social and emotional issues. So I wouldn't necessarily say, oh yeah, every primary care physician at every visit should start asking about anger. I do think kind of caring for mental health is a different story where often it is not just coming in for an annual physical, but it's multiple meetings with a psychiatrist or a therapist or a counselor, and there's some exploration as to what the underlying causes of this are. And so I do think in those sorts of contexts, it is pretty much always appropriate to ask about anger, about interpersonal hurts, and to ask would the person like resources to help forgive. Again, people may choose not to, but I think at least creating an awareness that these resources are available when someone is struggling with an offense, when someone wants to forgive and is having trouble doing so, I think that would be reasonable and worthwhile.
So here's a laser sharp question. Have any studies been done on cortisol stress levels before and after decisional forgiveness?
I'm fairly confident the answer to that is yes, but I have not been involved in those studies. Most of our work has been based on surveys and randomized trials rather than biological or neurological measurement. But there are groups of people who work on forgiveness who are doing that, and so I can't speak with 100% certainty, but I'm fairly sure that has been examined as well.
Good. You made some distinctions between various other things and forgiveness. What's the difference between forgiveness and mercy?
Yeah, so I would say both are oriented towards goodwill, towards one in need, but forgiveness is always in the context of an offense, whereas I think mercy need not be. Mercy can be extended in cases where there's a need or where there's suffering. And I think that is offering some way to alleviate that offer of an action that helps address the needs, helps address the suffering, I think is an act of mercy. So while I would say forgiveness in some sense does constitute an act of mercy, mercy is a much broader category. It does not require an offense in advance, unlike forgiveness.
Good. Well, I've been overwhelmed by so many good questions that people have offered. I want to thank you so much and say again, please fill out the survey on the way out. There is also a beautiful poster of the upcoming conference, which you've heard about. Next week, Thursday evening through Saturday, speakers from far and wide looking at forgiveness from a whole variety of different viewpoints and free and open to the public. So, thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks for being here.